guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Dear Professor Dr. Patterson, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight in the Museum Hegel-Haus for the Colloquium Slavery and Genocide, the US, Jamaica, and the Historical Sociology of Evil with Professor Dr. Orlando Patterson. My name is Elena Keifel. I'm the director here of the Museum Hegel-Haus, and I welcome you all very much, and we're very happy to have you. Yeah, this evening marks a special occasion at the Museum Hegel-Haus as we host an extraordinary guest, Dr. Orlando Patterson, who has traveled all the way from the United States to join us. He just arrived today in the morning, and tonight's event is part of a program surrounding the Hegel Prize 2024, which is awarded every 3 years by the city of Stuttgart in collaboration with us, with the Museum Hegel-Haus. The prize was first established in 1970 to commemorate the 200th birthday of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and the Hegel Prize honors individuals who have made exceptional contributions to the humanities, and it is recognized internationally as one of the most prestigious awards in philosophy. Tomorrow, the Hegel Prize 2024 will be formally awarded to Professor Dr. Patterson in the Grand Hall of the Stuttgart City Hall. You're all welcome to join. So Professor Patterson is a Jamaican-American historian and sociologist holding the esteemed John Cowles Chair in Sociology at Harvard University. He is renowned for his groundbreaking work on the history of slavery in the United States and Jamaica, as well as on the sociology of development. His 1991 book, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, won the US National Book Award for nonfiction. His academic focus spans the cultural and institutional practices of freedom, the comparative study of slavery, and the cultural sociology of poverty. Beyond academia, Professor Patterson has been a public intellectual, serving for 8 years as a special advisor on social policy and development to Jamaican Prime Minister Michael Manley. He has also contributed to prominent publications such as the New York Times, Time Magazine, and the Washington Post. And these are just a few highlights of his remarkable career. The jury of the Hegel Prize articulated their decision with these following words. Orlando Patterson is one of the most significant voices on the political and social conditions tied to structural racism, not only in the United States, but globally. His central focus is slavery, exploring both its historical dimensions and its lasting impact on contemporary society. Patterson's sociology extends to values, beliefs, and symbolic representations, as well as the practices and dispositions that underpin institutions. In this way, Patterson's understanding of culture resonates deeply with Hegel's concept of Sittlichkeit. Echoing Hegel, Patterson examines slavery as a cultural practice and the conditions that perpetuate it. In this evening's colloquium, Professor Patterson will address a pressing and deeply challenging topic in his lecture, Slavery and Genocide, the US, Jamaica, and the Historical Sociology of Evil. Through a comparative historical lens, he will explore how slavery and genocide intersect as systems of extreme social exclusion. Highlighting the concept of slavery as a form of social death and analyzing contested definitions of genocide, he will invite us to reflect on how these atrocities continue to shape contemporary injustices. We are very delighted to have you, Professor Patterson, and all our esteemed guests here at the Museum Hegel-Haus tonight to engage with these fascinating topics. We wish you a wonderful, enriching evening, and thank you very much. Enjoy this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your invitation and look forward to both the discussion this evening and the festivities tomorrow. So this is a subject which, as you know, covers two of the worst atrocities, iniquities in human history. No one denies that. Um, there is, of course, growing scholarly interest in both. Um, the, um, the historiography of slavery, however, is interestingly much older than the that of genocide. Um, Genocide scholarship, in fact, emerged only in the 70s and took off in a significant way even later. I remember when I was a student and later a lecturer at the London School of Economics in the 60s, I, and I was interested in both subjects then, I was quite struck by how little work there was on genocide. So slavery scholarship, however, is more mature. It's been going on for quite a while. Um, the Going back to the abolitionist movement. Um, However, it's important to emphasize that um, genocide as a subject, while it's fairly recent compared with the study of slavery, um, goes back, it's as ancient as slavery itself. One of the curious features of genocide scholarship, in fact, is the tendency on the part of some scholars to see it as largely a modern phenomenon. As a matter of fact, there's several quite prominent genocide scholars who insist that it's a distinct product of modernity. That is absolutely not the case. And there's a kind of fascination among social scientists and some historians with modernity as being very special in its effects, both in the good things it's done and in the horrors it's produced. It is simply not the case. And fortunately, that view is being corrected. So slavery and genocide are both ancient. Um, and related. Um, the ancient Greeks, we know, known for a long time, um, um, had slavery, large-scale slave societies. Um, as Hegel knew, because he had a lot to say about that. Um, but some of the worst acts of genocide were committed by the Greeks, often against other Greeks. Anyway, I just want to begin by emphasizing that um, fact. And so what I'd like to do is several things. Um, First, explore the nature of slavery and genocide. What is distinctive about them? Uh, and and introduce an important um, concept for related phenomenon, that of ethnocide. And that distinction, genocide and ethnocide, I'll then use in the second part of the talk to explore in more empirical terms two societies which exemplify this major division in the sociology of evil, if you like. Um, Genocide ethnocide as they relate to slavery. Um, in a nutshell, what I'm going to be arguing is that ethnocide um, is best, both are related to slavery in important ways, both slavery and both genocide and ethnocide. But ethnocide is best exemplified in the case of the US South. Um, Genocide when is best exemplified in the case of Jamaica during the 18th and early 19th centuries, which I'll try to argue was an extreme case of genocide, resulting in the deaths of almost 6 million people. That's a figure which, of course, is a very significant one in genocide studies. So it may come as a surprise to many of you that genocide of that nature existed in the Americas and in slavery. Um, I'll call it a special kind of genocide, protracted genocide. And I'll use a special technique, counterfactual analysis, in comparing Jamaica and the US in the 18th and 19th centuries, to make the case that Jamaican slavery was indeed genocide on a huge scale. We'll begin by exploring what we mean by slavery, especially large-scale slavery, and what we mean by genocide. Now, I have defined slavery in a special way. For a long time, the standard definition of the enslaved, and this I'm sure is what you're acquainted with, is that the slave is quintessentially one who's owned as property by another, treated as an object of ownership. And many people still hold that view. In my book, Slavery and Social Death, I challenge that view, that definition of slavery, on the grounds not that it's wrong, but that it's limited in that it's restricted to certain kinds of slave and slave societies. And it was a view of slavery which originated with the Romans. Indeed, the development of the very concept of ownership, of dominion by the Romans, was very intimately related to the development of slavery and slave society in ancient Rome itself. And I've argued, controversially, that the very concept of dominion, the idea of ownership, which we associate so much with the Romans, was in fact developed, constructed largely in response to the growth of large-scale slavery in ancient Rome. But the point I want to make is that that view of the slave then as someone who is owned by another. As you know, there in the West there are two major traditions of law. The one that exists mainly in continental Europe, civil law, which is strongly influenced by Rome. Roman law is inherited from Roman legal system. And the common law traditions, the British, which the British then spread all over the world. And central to the distinction between them is that of the nature of ownership. Now, I won't get into this, it's very complex. In my book, which is coming out in January, and I seize the opportunity of selling it, as a long chapter on this. But what I want to say is that the idea of the slave as someone who's essentially someone who is owned by another derives from that tradition, and it's accurate in describing what happened in slavery in Rome in the Middle Ages. Um, and of course, the concept was taken over by the Europeans to their own slave societies. However, slavery existed in many other parts of the world, and which is what my book, Slavery and Social Death, studied. And what I found was that the concept of ownership is simply inadequate in understanding uh, the nature of slavery. People weren't necessarily owned. Slaves weren't always owned in the sense that they were disposable property. Why? Because the whole concept of property did not exist in many societies as you understand it in civil law. There are many people who were clearly slaves who could not be sold. Among Islamic peoples, for example, a slave woman who gives birth to a son is very often, and religiously, the woman is required not to sell her. On the other hand, there are many cases in societies with slavery, in which people were sold who were not slaves. The phenomenon anthropologists among you will know of bride wealth um, um, involves the sale of bride. Now, anthropologists have clouded the issue by claiming it's not really a sale. So, but as Levi Strauss and others have pointed out, it did involve a sale on marriage. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at is that the fact of selling someone is an inadequate criterion for slavery, because there are lots of people who are sold who are not slaves. In fact, provocatively, I've even argued that US athletes are bought and sold. I mean, if you read the newspapers, that's what they said. So and so was sold to the Buffalo Bills yesterday. Um, um, but the important point is that it's the Roman conception of slavery, while accurate in describing Western slaveries in the Caribbean and the US, is inadequate if you're going to do a comparative look at slavery. So what was central then to slavery? Well, the slave is characterized by, it's a relation of domination and is distinctive in three respects. The totality of the domination of the slave by the slave owner, the enslaver. By the way, in America now, the term master is frowned upon. We use the word enslaver or slaveholder, although sometimes I'll fall into the term. And we'll have to retranslate Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, because the most famous chapter, the fourth chapter, has been widely translated as the master-slave dialectic. Well, we have to change that because people frown upon the use of the term master to describe what's now called it's got to be called the enslaver-enslaved dialectic. That's the proper, anyway. American scholarship is full of this kind of fine distinctions, which people get very worked up about. Anyway, the totality of the domination of slaves. This is unusual in human societies. People dominate others in traditional societies. But it's unheard of for someone to have total power of life and death over another person. And that's what owners had, regardless of what the laws may say. Many slave societies have laws which say you shouldn't kill a slave. They're dead letters, as we say. And that's unusual. The second characteristic, which I've strongly emphasize and introduce to the understanding of slavery is what I call natal alienation. The slave is a deracinated person. The slave is uprooted from another society, brought into the society of the slave owner, but not considered a member of that society. He or she does not belong because they belong to someone. They have no sense of belonging to the society. They are non-persons. They have no history. They have no ancestry because they've been uprooted from their ancestors. But they have no descendants because their children are not their own. Their children are owned by others. They are what I call genealogical isolates. And that idea is central to slavery, more than the notion of ownership and so on. The fact that the slave does not belong, is an isolate, is not a member of the society in which they were born. And it's the element of slavery which, if anything, most persists after slavery. The third characteristic of the slave is their dishonor, their degradation. Slave is an utterly degraded person, which no one has any need to respect their honor. You know, in the traditional Germanic societies, not only here, but among the Anglo-Saxons and later other peoples, the Wehrgilt. Everyone has a Wehrgilt, okay? And that's centrally related to their honor, the fact that there's a price on how much your Wehrgilt was, but the important thing is to insult someone, you have to pay for that. That's an extreme case. The important point is the slave had no honor. Women could be raped, and the Wehrgilt involved in raping someone is often death, or a pretty huge sum. But women could be raped with impunity, spat upon, and so on. The slave had no honor. So total domination, natal alienation, and degradation are the characteristic of slavery in all societies. And that's what I introduced to the literature and understanding that the totality of these three factors amounts to a condition of social death. And it's some people have misunderstood this. This is not something which I, as a sociology theorist, imposed upon the data, as some historians have been saying. The remarkable thing, if you look at slavery comparatively, is that the idea of the slave being a socially dead person is given symbolic expression in almost all societies. And I went, in my book, Slavery and Social Death, I explored this at great length, the symbolic designation of the slave as a dead person. Often, symbols of death and mourning are imposed upon the slave. My favorite example, an extreme one, but is one of the early tribes of the Caribbean, the Caribs, who had a lot of slaves. The slave was required to cut their hair. And by the way, the cutting of the hair was an important sort of symbolic definition of slavery. But the interesting thing about the Caribs is that when someone died and were in mourning, they cut their hair in a certain way. Now, all slaves had to cut their hair as if in mourning. They were mourning their own death. And you found that symbol powerfully in all the societies. The symbolism of death is associated with the slaves. It's funny. In Rome, of course, the whole concept of being civil death existed. The slave was experienced civil death, but I found fascinating and documented at great length the symbolic expression of that idea that the slave was dead. Now, the implications of that have been devastating for slaves and for slaves, the descendants of slaves. What this means, you see, my definition of slavery means, in fact, that it goes beyond just a legality. What it means is that it's a cultural phenomenon, a psychological one, and so simply removing the legal status of the slave, as happens in the Act of Emancipation, say in 1865 in America or wherever, does not take account of the fact that a whole culture of slavery exists. And you can't abolish a culture and a set of attitudes and so on with the stroke of a legal pen. So in 1865, what was abolished was the legal condition of the slave, the black slave in America. What was not abolished was the social death of the slave and the fact that the mass of white Americans continue to hold those views. So there's a long post-slavery period in America, or post-legal slavery, which was a kind of neo-slavery. We call it Jim Crow and so on. And black Americans remained slaves in the sense in which I have defined it, other than legally, for a long time. And that's why that was expressed in horrendous acts of violence towards them, which went unpunished. Thousands of them were lynched, often ritually to express a symbolic fact that they were still culturally slaves. So, and that had devastating effects also on the slave. Imagine being in that condition. What does that mean? Now I won't get into this in too great detail, but psychologists have developed interesting ideas about what it is to be human. What constitutes, it's a question you don't usually ask. What are the fundamental elements of being human? And one of my favorite social psychologists, Susan Fiske, drawing on long tradition of scholars who work on this, is what is summarized it very well in her book, Social Beings. And these 5 factors to be human, which is called the core motives in being human, is central to it. It's a sense of belonging, that you belong. A sense of belonging to a society, to a group, is fundamental to the experience of being human. But it also involves trust, being able to trust others and trusted, having some control over one's life, no matter how limited. One can determine what one do. You get up in the morning, I'm going to go shopping, I'm going to make breakfast, I'm going to visit my mother, or whatever. You have some control over your life. That's essential, however limited. A sense of oneself and the capacity, well, the belief that one is loved, and an understanding of one's world, some comprehension of that world, the world in which you live. Now, what I've argued, the reason why I like Fiske's work so much is that it maps perfectly with the condition of what is not a slave. These are precisely the things which the slave is denied. Most centrally, as I mentioned before, not belonging. And in fact, Fisk and other social psychologists have argued that belonging is the central element of one's humanity, which holds the others together. And belonging was what most powerfully the slave is denied, what I've called nature alienation. Slavery was then an assault on every one of these core human needs. So that's slavery. Let's move to genocide. And maybe I'm going to avoid reading because it goes on much longer. And I don't want to go over time. Well, here in Germany, of course, there's been a lot of discussion of what that is. I mean, but the debate over what constitutes genocide, when I got into the literature, is quite surprising. It's very contentious. Now, as you know, there's a formal definition of what constitutes genocide from the United Nations 1948 Convention and so on. It means, and I quote the definition here, it comes from Raphael Lemking, the Polish Jewish lawyer, who was very, very important in the 40s in defining. In fact, he invented the word genocide in an early work. And was an important influence on the United Nations definition. But this definition is now sort of entered international law. So it's important to know it means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a nation, ethnic, racial, or religious group. As such. Now that English term, as such, is very important, especially with lawyers. Killing members of a group, one. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. It's important to remember that in terms of what I'll have to say later. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction or whole and in part. Now this one is very important. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. We need to think about that one for a minute. It's one of the central elements in international law now. And forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. It was ratified by 149 states eventually in 2018. Now, a little side story. The United States is, of course, very, very involved with the anti-Nazi movement in the Second War and so on. The United States took its time ratifying this convention. But it didn't do so, I think, until the 70s, over 20 years after. And there's a lot of interesting work done, which I cited at length in my book, in the chapter on which this lecture is based. The reason why the United States was very reluctant to sign this, this treaty is their concern that it may apply to Black Americans. Not during slavery, but then, right then in 48, because in 48 was still the Jim Crow period, the neo-slavery period I mentioned earlier. And the US was very bothered that they could get charged, or even more than Black Americans could bring a case against them on the grounds that they're practicing genocide on them then still during the period of Jim Crow. And it took a lot of argument and so on to persuade the US authorities to very reluctantly finally sign this. even though they were very much involved with the UN Convention. Of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the great sort of American president, was very instrumental in the UN Convention leading to genocide. But the US didn't sign it formally. Anyway, that's another story. No, quite apart from the US's concern about it, if it eventually did, nearly every one of these clauses has been contested by genocide scholars and by others since then. One of the biggest bone of contention is the issue of intent. Intent. There are also reasons for this. And in fact, the US in the negotiations insisted that this clause be in this definition. And all the colonial powers were also on the side of the US in insisting that intent. I mean, this is why all the insistence. Well, you may kill a large number of people accidentally, or as a collateral damage, say in warfare. Jean-Paul Sartre, there's a huge controversy about this clause, by the way, and Sartre was very prominent in this. And during the Vietnam War, he insisted that this is genocide. And of course, the US then went back to this clause and said, no, I mean, we may kill hundreds of thousands of them, we may drop napalm on them and so on, but it wasn't intentional. It was, we did not intentionally mean to kill them as a people. It was not the intent. It was a collateral damage of warfare. And you can't define all for warfare as genocide. And it was not our intent to kill the Vietnamese as such. That's where the term, the English term, as such, became so important legally. It was not our intention as such. It's an unfortunate aspect of the war that hundreds of thousands of them got killed, and killed in very horrible ways by chemicals and so on. But you see, so Sartre said that's nonsense. That's genocide. The killing of indigenous North Americans and so on, and that's now a lively topic, whether in fact the treatment of Native Americans in Canada and the US is genocide. This is happening right now. The Pope, the present Pope just last year formally declared the treatment of Native Americans, especially children, were moved from their own as genocide. There's a problem of political groups, the killing of political groups. And here, the Russians were very concerned about this one. Because what happens when a policy leads to the death of millions of people? Stalin's nationalization of farms and shift to collectivization in Russia and in Ukraine led to the death of millions of peasants. Was that genocide? And some people insist that it was the political genocide. Prevention of birth, well, that's an interesting one, which I'll get to later. So these are all the issues which I've gone into in great detail in, I took up each one in the chapter. And others have argued, that this legal definition is much too narrow and that you need a broader, more sociological definition. And others have, much of the literature on genocide now concerns just this. How do we go beyond this? And so Helen Fine has done great work on this. He defined a sustained purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity, directly or indirectly, through interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of the group. There's a Cambridge World History of Slavery, which, by the way, I strongly recommend. It's sort of a 4-volume work of many thousands of pages, in which I can say, honestly, I've read every page, which is excellent. Because one of the things it proves is it completely demolishes the modernity of genocide argument by showing that genocide has existed throughout history. And in fact, some of the genocides we may not even know about, the most extreme, the most complete form of genocide, far more so than the Nazi genocide of the Jews, took place in earlier times. But the best example I know of, if you like, the sort of most classic case of genocide resulting in the not just the killing, but the total elimination of the group, was what happened in the Canary Islands off the coast of Europe. Many of you may have gone to the Canaries for vacation and so on. The Canaries were wiped out. The culture, they had several languages, they had a fairly rich culture. The culture was totally destroyed. But more important, the population was almost completely eliminated. So history shows many cases of genocide, even worse than they are the Nazi genocide. As I said, it goes back. We go back. The Roman treatment of Carthage was perhaps one of the earliest classic genocides, in which the population of Carthage was simply totally decimated. Mother, father, children, all massacred systematically as such. As such, that they were killed because they were Carthaginians. So the idea of the modernity of genocide is nonsense. So the Cambridge history defines it as a form of genocide that targets groups where the purpose of violence is the destruction of the group. We can think of genocide as a form of group selective or categorical violence, in that the criterion that perpetrators use to target individuals is their ostensible individual membership in a group. So it's organized violence against a targeted group involving mass killings with the intention of eliminating them. I have concerns about the intention of eliminating them. We're back to that problem. Genocide, then, for me, further includes forced prevention of reproduction. I want to emphasize that as a fundamental important factor. Forced sterilization, infanticide, preventable high infant mortality, and gendercide. This is a concept which has emerged recently, but it's a very important one. It's one of the great cases of genocide which is not completely understood or recognized, even though it's happening now. If I were to say to you that there are at least 143 million women, and some estimates go as much as 200 million missing women in the world, you may be all quite shocked. The concept of gendercide has emerged recently. And what is that? It's the deliberate elimination of a group because of their gender. And why is that? It's happening now. And it's in fact escalated with one simple technical development, invention, the ability to identify the gender of a fetus. So cultures which have a strong preference for boys found that to be just a gift from God, or the devil, if you may want to call it. And gender-specific feticide, as you may want, abortions, is not widespread. But anyway, we can, because of a simple fact of biology, we know, with natural birth, slightly more boys are born than girls. Yeah, 1% or so. But by the age of 1 or 2, the genders are even because boys have a much higher infant mortality than girls. So this is a biological constant. So, but one can simply use this biological constant. If you notice that the, you know, the ratio of men to women by age 10 or so, or 5, is out of whack, you know something is going on. And so demographers can easily estimate how many women have been eliminated by just looking at the simple disparity in the ages. Some countries, it's as high as 130. That is to say, in parts of northern India, there are 130 men to every 100 women. Where are the women? Anyway, so genocide is an important aspect of genocide. It includes dangerous medical experiments and so on. And genocide, for me, can be protracted. I want that concept to be clear. We think of genocide when we think of the German Nazi case as a very concentrated pattern which took place over 4 years rather than 5. The killings didn't really begin until the late 40s. And as opposed to something which may exist over a long period of time, which I'll show you can also be calculated. Now, concept of cultural genocide is an important one. Lemkin actually used that term and tried to introduce it to the 1948 Convention on Genocide, but it was rejected. And this philosopher, Claudia Card, she died recently, has a theory of cultural genocide, which interestingly used my concept of social death in defining genocide. I was quite surprised. And she claims that we should get away from the body counts. And she argues, killing a group's culture is what's horrible, because that is what makes you human, as I pointed out earlier. Centering social death, she claims, accommodates the position, controversial among genocide scholars, that genocidal acts are not always or necessarily homicidal. And so she used my concept of social death to define her view of genocide. As she said, social death central to the evil of genocide, whether homicidal or not, distinguishes genocide from other mass murders. The big problem with genocide and studies is, of course, we know that there are, quote unquote, legitimate ways of mass killings, typically in warfare. So we're not going to define all warfare as genocide. So, and mass killings can't be the factor. Mass killings takes place in a lot of other situations, okay? But she claimed that killing the vitality of a people, their culture, the loss of identity, and therefore of meaning for one's existence, she claims is it. Now, there's a lot of debate among philosophers on this theory of hers. I've kept away from it, obviously, for this reason. And while attractive, many will find her position hard to sustain. I think the idea of physical death has got to be kept as an important one in the idea of genocide. And what I propose, and what others have proposed, is to distinguish between genocide and ethnocide. From ethnicity, the killing of an ethnic group, the destruction of their culture, their identity as a people. I call it ethnocide. Now you can have ethnocide with genocide. We're going to say that's what happened in Jamaica. But you can have ethnocide without genocide. Okay, this argument is a fierce one. It's big in Canada. It's increasingly in South America, and it has to do with Native Americans, what was happening among them. And as I said, the Pope's recent intervention is that, in a way, he took a Claudia Card's position. He's saying, pulling kids away from their parents to re-educate them in the culture of the whites is wicked, sinful, and is genocidal. He formally made that position just a year ago. Well, I want to distinguish, however, between genocide and ethnocide, which is the destruction of a people's culture. And I want to reemphasize the prevention of reproduction. Okay? All right. Now, let me get to the second major point I want to raise in this. There's been surprisingly little work done on comparing slavery and genocide. And people who've written on it have tried to keep the distinction very clear. There were several well-known works, interestingly, many of them using my theory of slavery to make the distinction between with genocide and slavery. So one famous work, which was a bestseller here in Germany, was, of course, Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. Some of you may have read it. It was a bestseller here in Germany. And he used my work to say that there's a fundamental difference in that the Nazis were interested in killing the Jews, not with exploiting their labor, although there was some earlier. The work Between Dignity and Despair by Marian Kaplan, again, used slavery and social death in her, what's now become a classic study. She said, in a sense, the period between 1935 and 1940 was one more of close to social death of the Jews, because they were being used in labor camps and so on, as opposed to what happened after 1940, the actual killing, for the sake of killing them. They died earlier from overwork and so on. But so a lot of scholars have been using my theory of slavery to make that distinction. Okay? And that includes other works such as Thomas's Vessels of Evil and so on. In general, people are saying that they're different, slavery and genocide. The important point emphasizes that the slaveholder, or enslaver, interest in the slave is to keep them alive so that they can exploit their labor. The genocidal person wants to kill the person, kill them, destroy their bodies, because they're not interested in their labor. And that's why Kaplan distinguishes between the early phase of the Nazi period, say 35 to 40, as more like a form of enslavement. But so, there's been controversy over this, which I can't get into. But in general, the point is to distinguish the two. I think it's a too monolithic view of New World slavery. There's tremendous variation. To simply say all slaveries are different, do not have, because of the emphasis on exploiting labor and wanting to keep the slave alive, therefore it couldn't be genocide as opposed to genocide. I think it's important to recognize that there are tremendous variation in systems of slavery. And I'm going to argue this evening that there are certain kinds of slavery which amounted to genocide. And the two paradigmatic places I want to use are Jamaica in the 18th and early 19th century, when slavery existed, British slavery from 1655 to 1834 to 38, and US slavery. During the same period. Are the two classic cases. One, I think, is the classic case of ethnocide. The other, I'm saying, yes, you had ethnocide in Jamaica, but it amounted to what I'm calling protracted genocide. And I can prove it in the numbers. There are very different kinds of systems. And in the ownership of slaves, the average slave owner in America had only about 10 slaves, and the average ownership in Jamaica is 120. This is large-scale plantation slavery. Majority of the population in America were free and white. The great majority in Jamaica were slaves. This is a classic slave society. The planter class was resident in the US and were proud of creating a new society, a new Jerusalem. Whereas in Jamaica, the ideal was once you made your money, you got the hell out of that hellhole you've created and went to Britain and so on. They differed in terms of wealth. It's been estimated that the average white person in Jamaica in the 18th century at the height of the system was 35 times more wealthy than the average income earned by whites in Jamaica. Okay? The US was a stable system. The Jamaican system was one fraught with civil war. Okay? This is a condition of social death. And in Jamaica, it amounted to physical genocide. What I've argued is that in the US, you had a simple demographic profile. The slave population reproduced. By the early 1700s, the American black population was reproducing, self-reproducing. And that happened throughout. And the number of blacks who were born in America always exceeded the number who came in from outside. In Jamaica, the strategy was completely different. The slaveholders there in the production of cane wanted young blacks, healthy, and it wanted as many of them as it could get. Sugar production was extremely labor intensive and brutal, far more brutal than the tobacco production demands or even cotton production. And the basic strategy of the Jamaican slave owners was, let's buy as many as we can. And if they die, we'll just replace them by buying more through the slave trade. So the slave trade became central. Okay? And they were not interested in reproduction. So it's a deliberate strategy of non-reproduction. The result was really quite remarkable. An incredible 1.017 million people were delivered to this tiny island over the 130 years between 1650 and 1830. I'm going to show you a remarkable set of statistics on this. Before I get to this, I want to, the argument I'm going to make is a counterfactual one. We're going to look at the amount of slaves who were brought, and we have accurate data on this, by the way, remarkable amount. We're going to show you the amount of slaves who were brought in and to Jamaica, as opposed to the amount of slaves who were brought into the United States. My argument, as I said, is counterfactual. What I'm going to do is I'm going to simply argue that This tiny little island, more slaves were brought, far more than to the US. If the Jamaican slave population had been allowed to reproduce at the same rate as the not very great reproduction rate of the United States, you would have had a much larger population at the end of the period of slavery than you actually found. So I'm using the US as a counterfactual. And I'm saying the difference between what one would expect to find using the US reproductive rate in Jamaica and what actually existed at the end of the period, that difference is the number of Africans who were in fact genocidally eliminated. That's the basic counterfactual argument. So I just want to show you the volume. This is really extraordinary, going to Jamaica and the US. This map is a video version of real data. This is not simulated data I'm going to show you. One of the most remarkable forms of historical things going on is that we have a lot of data on slave trade, on the slave trade. And the Atlantic Slave Trade Organization, they're now based in Rice University, they were originally at Harvard, has been able to track down every slave ship over the centuries of the slave trade. And we have data on them. Because remember, the thing about ships is that you have to manifest. You're required to write down the number of sailors, the number of cargo, in this case, Africans, how many died, how many left, how many arrived. It's wonderful data. And it's all there in the ship manifest. Much better data than anything in the European history, certainly among the working classes and so on. And that's all been brought together by the Atlantic Slave Trade Group. So, but let me show you something, an animated version, which brings out the contrast between the numbers going to the US and those going to Jamaica. Okay. And now let's see. Let me get this here. Let's see if it, okay. And okay. Now, what you see there are the ships going, each one of these is a ship going to the New World from Africa. Each one represents a slave ship. This is about 1680. You'll see from the vertical thing down there. Now look what's happening. If you go to 1700, you see what's happening. Each dot, remember, is a ship. And the colors, let me explain. The colors are the different countries. You see Portugal is kind of blue, Britain is red, France is yellow, the Netherlands is the sort of bright blue, and so on. You see all the countries were involved. Little Denmark was very much involved, Portugal, and so on. The important thing here is, you can look. These are not simulated data. So for example, let's take a look here. You see, this was a ship called the Neptune, a British ship. So 120 tons, we actually know it, which left wider in West Africa with 370 enslaved people and arrived in New York River with 350. That's the level of detail we have. So every one of these dots is a ship. For over 300 years, we have this incredible data. Okay, and down here, we just use that bar for the year you want. So right now, we're in about 1720. And I want to continue. Okay, let me start up again. So you see what's happening. The number of ships going to the Caribbean compared with America. This tiny little island. This, by the way, this is Jamaica. This is Jamaica. Okay, keep an eye on that. This is another major slave area, Saint-Domingue, what's now known as Haiti. The other side of which is, this is Haiti. That's now the Dominican Republic. That's Cuba. Notice hardly anyone was going to Cuba during the 18th century. And this is all of the United States there. So you see what's happening, how many ships are going to this tiny little island compared with America, um, uh, especially during the 18th century where we are right now. Just look, as the 18th century progresses, it gets more and more. I mean, they're all going to Jamaica. This is one little ship. This is the year 1723. We have one ship, okay, the Gascoigne, British, okay, taking 192 people. Look at the number of ships going to Jamaica. Okay, this little one here is a Commerce, a 90-ton ship taking 251 enslaved people. Okay, and that's the pattern throughout the 18th century. It is just incredible what's happening. Now you begin to see a lot are going to Brazil and so on. But it was merciless, the numbers going to the Caribbean. And as you know, this is when the Caribbean was far wealthier than the United States for most of the 18th century. Believe it or not, these little islands, compare with the situation today. um, look, so you see what I'm talking about. A little more going there, but just an incredible. Well, you get the idea. By 1780, the pattern was. Now you begin to see more are now beginning to go to Cuba. Cuba doesn't really enter the picture until the late 18th century. But look at that. Look at what's happening to Jamaica. The red going there. And every one of them is a slave ship going to this tiny little island, you know, and anyway, you get the idea. I love to show that. Now, what do these figures amount to? As you can see here, um, this is a graph showing the numbers going into Jamaica. And I want to, let me get to my notes because I want to actually cite the figures to you. Okay. So, yeah, this is where we are. Let's look at the actual data. So what I'm saying is that the demographic strategy of the Jamaicans was one of deliberate destruction, if you like. And I think so let's look at figures 1 and 2. We need the, let me see, where are my data? Okay. I just summarize it here. I mean, the earlier graph showed you the remarkable difference here. Look, this is the relative percentage of slaves disembarked in Jamaica and North America. Okay, blue is North America, red is Jamaica. It's just incredible. This is the whole continent of America compared with Jamaica. Far more slaves were going to this tiny island than all of North America. Now, here's the actual data. In the period between 1650 and 1830, when slavery was abolished, well, it says abolished over a period of between 1834 and 1838. It's a complicated story, but let's take 1830. Over 1 million Africans were taken to Jamaica, while the total number of Africans taken to all of the US, all of them, was 388,233. Okay, so well over 3 times the amount of Africans were taken to Jamaica as to all of America, number one. In 1830, however, and we have all the statistics on this, there were 2 million, a little over 2.009 million enslaved African, people of African ancestry in America, including freed blacks. When we include freed blacks, people of African ancestry, it's 2.3 million people, black people, people of color, were in the US. Okay, resulting from a situation in which they were reproducing. Now, as I said, it wasn't that the Americans were all that wonderful, they didn't feed them all that well and so on, but that's why it's good to use that as a counterfactual. This is what could have happened, that you just had a normal reproductive strategy in which you weren't discouraging reproduction on the part of the women, in which you weren't working people to death, and so on. At the same time, it's only 319,000 enslaved, and including the few freed blacks, 357,147 blacks were there in Jamaica. So my basic argument is that had Africans and their descendants experienced the same rate of increase as the US, the 1830 black population of Jamaica should have been 5.2 million, 5,262,522. And its total, including freed blacks, should have been 6,090,000. That's what would have been the population had it had the quite moderate reproduction rate of the counterfactual I'm using, which is the US, over the same period instead. So all we do is we look at the actual amount of survivors, which is 359,000 in 1830. And what we found, we just subtract that from the total amount that should have been there using the US counterfactual. And the difference is just the number of people who experienced genocide. That's my simple argument, which was 5.7 million people. Does that argument strike you as reasonable? Because many people are quite shocked when they first see this and say, wait a minute, something is wrong here. You're making this up. I'm not making this up. I'm using real data here because I said these are not simulated data. This is real data. Okay. And this is the claim I'm making. Now, I call it protracted genocide because this happened over a period of about 130 years, as opposed to the concentrated genocide that existed in Germany, between 40 and 45. But it's genocide nonetheless. And it gets back to the point I raised earlier, because the major factor was the refusal, the active discouragement of reproduction in Jamaica. I mean, there are all sort of ways in which I specified in the paper. I don't have the time to get into here, but for example, the planters absolutely hated it when slave women got pregnant. They're losing the labor when they were pregnant. So they worked them right up to a few days before they gave birth. And after they gave birth, they took the baby and gave it to an old woman, and the woman, after 3 days, had to go back to work. The infant mortality rate was enormous. Most kids died within the first few weeks of being born. There's also the fact that women were raped, and I pointed out, as genocide scholars have pointed out too, the active discouragement, but also women were raped, and one extraordinary data we have is almost all the women ended up getting gonorrhea. With Africans, within 3 months, they all had the European version of gonorrhea, which is very destructive of reproduction. And they were beaten and so on. So my argument that this was active process of destruction, prevention of reproduction of a group, which is listed in the UN definition anyway as one of the characteristics of genocide. So this is the measure of physical genocide in Jamaica. Bringing over more men than women, too, since they were buying. If your population is naturally reproducing, you're going to have the same number of men as women as you get in the US. If you look at the Jamaican population at any time, there are far more men than women. So men, even if they wanted to get married, couldn't. Marriage was actively discouraged. In fact, you couldn't get married among the slaves and so on. So there were, of course, to conclude, differences. One is temporal. The Jewish social deaths lasted for 12 years, if you like, while that of Jamaica, 183 years. The Jewish physical destruction concentrated over a period of 4 years, while Jamaica's lasted for 183. And the nature of the elimination, the Jews' actual living bodies were destroyed. In Jamaica, there were people killed and murdered and beaten and whipped mercilessly and so on, which led to shortened lives. But apart from the murders, and there were lots of slave revolts, by the way, in which, I saw the pictures here. This one way of terrorizing the population. You just hang them up on those poles. And they'd say that for weeks, they're eaten by crows, vultures. So this was a pretty grim situation. So apart from these murders and shortened lives, potential lives were preventively eliminated. Yeah, so I'll, so that is, I'm just, this is just a wrap up of the consequences, both external and internal consequences of slavery in Jamaica have been devastating. This is another story. In fact, last week I spoke at a reparations conference in America, which is very interesting, the different attitudes of Black Americans and Black Jamaicans who acknowledge the importance of slavery and its devastating internal consequences, which continues to this day. The violence is persisted, and Jamaica is a violent society. And but that's another story, actually. And I wrote about Jamaican slavery in my first book. But also I started off life as a novelist. I published 3 novels, but then decided that living as a novelist was too precarious economically, so I went to sociology. But I wrote a novel on slavery, Died a Long Day. And I use a dirge. There's a dirge which was sung in Jamaica. So it's derived from a Fanti dirge when people died. Now, the point of this, you see this picture here. Whenever slaves died, they celebrated. It was the end of their torture. And they were going back, their spirits were going back to Africa. And there was a ceremony of carrying the corpse, in which you carry the corpse, it's a lithograph, around the community, and they all said goodbye, gave messages to go back to Africa. And so this was a celebration. So bad it was. And dirges were sung. And this dirge, which I use in my novel, but for real dirge, was It's very interesting. Do not say anything, O mother, sister. Do not say anything, for anything you say will be too much, and nothing you say will be enough. Slavery. It sort of reminds me of Arendt's banality of evil. It's almost impossible to describe, but I think this little turd nicely summarizes. But so that's the argument. As I said, the details, which I've left out, you can read in the long chapter on this. For example, some historians, economic historians, have been critical of arguing that Stanley Engelman, who's a fine economist, he died recently, and he's actually a friend, but he tried to explain the high mortality rate among the blacks in Jamaica by saying, no, it wasn't because of difference in cruelty of treatment, but because of the lactation practices of African women. That is lactation and breastfeeding. That their practices was to sort of have long breastfeeding period. And that's what accounts for the reduced mortality. No, that's absolutely not the case. And there are other explanations of the difference, which I went into, which I don't have the time to detail here, in which I was able to systematically counter. So what we have then is what I think we'll agree is genocide in a slave system, which, if you accept the counterfactual method I use, amounted to almost 6 million people who were missing. That's the story. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. Now, I mean, and that's a very much one of the big distinctions between the U.S. and Jamaica. Women were raped in the U.S. too, and abused, no doubt about that. But they were seen as instrumental in reproducing the population and were actively encouraged. And that's reflected, by the way, in the actual prices. Especially, the U.S. is very unusual among large-scale slave societies in one important respect. The slave trade was abolished in 1807. And that, of course, almost immediately begin to see the beginning of the collapse of the Caribbean system, because they depended on, in fact, no reproduction from outside. And when the outside source dried up suddenly, it created a real crisis. They tried to get the woman to reproduce. The woman refused. In the US, on the other hand, the system began to grow significantly with the invention of the cotton gin and so on. Remember, cotton came late to America. For the whole of the 18th century, it was primarily in the North, in Virginia, growing tobacco, and in the Carolinas, rice and so on. The huge plantation system came after the slave trade was abolished, with the rise of the cotton kingdom in the South and the Southwest. Huge numbers were in, but now women were valuable. They needed them to reproduce. They did everything to get them to reproduce. It's reflecting the prices of a young, healthy woman was actually worth more than a man. So you found a policy of actively encouraging reproduction, as opposed to Jamaica, where that was never the case, except after 1807 when they tried. Now, what's significant is that women refused the invitation suddenly of the planters to encourage reproduction on the grounds that they didn't want to bring children into this horrible system. So, women, a lot of slavery focuses on the role of women in important ways. And I said in the US as reproducers. In fact, there was an internal slave trade in America in which women are actively encouraged to reproduce so that their children could be sold down in the South. And as opposed to the situation in Jamaica. The abuse of women in Jamaica goes beyond just the fact that preventing their reproduction. One of the most well-documented accounts we have of slavery was from a slave owner in Jamaica in the mid-18th century who kept a diary for almost 30 years of all his relationships, including his sexual relationships with slave women. And it was reproduced recently. And it was chilling reading because, the way in which women were used, every one of them, on this large plantation. So women were the focus of slavery in very distinctive ways, both either in preventing their reproduction and in exploiting them sexually and their labor. And by the way, an interesting thing to note, if you look at the pictures, if you look at the graphics in Caribbean slavery, especially Jamaica, you'll notice one interesting. Take a look at this lithograph on a slave plantation. Do you notice something peculiar about it? There are mainly women doing the hardest work in the field. You may wonder about that. This is they're hoeing. They use the hoe as the instrument, main instrument. Now, the reason for that is that the sugar plantation is, as I'm called, a complex production system. It is often called a factory in the field because one of the interests, you not only grew the sugar, you had to produce it, process it there. Now, usually in colonial situations, you do not get that. You get the production of the raw material and you send it abroad to be processed. You can't do that with sugar. The reason why you can't do that with sugar is that the cane begins to lose its sucrose content almost immediately after you cut it. And if you were to try to ship cane from Jamaica to England, by the time you got to England, there's been no sugar left in the cane. So it had to be processed there. So you had these elaborate factories. In fact, there's a whole historiography on the origins of capitalism in Caribbean slavery. One of our great historians, Eric Williams, has written on a classic study, Capitalism and Slavery. The sugar plantation was the origins of capitalism. And more recently, a German-American scholar, if some of you may know, Sven Beckert. Sven comes from Stuttgart, somewhere near here. But he's become a major slave scholar. And what he's shown is that a later phase of capitalism, industrial, originated in the centrally involved with the production of cotton in the US, because that's what fed the factories of Lancashire in producing cotton, and it was the source of the Industrial Revolution. But anyway, the important point I want to make is that, to get back to your point, a lot of the slaves, the male slaves, were used in the more technical part of the production in the mills. The women were then, with gender attitudes being as they were doing the hardest work in the fields. The hardest work, as you can see from the digging, cutting, and so on, was done by a woman. So women were harshly, brutally, directly treated, both physically, sexually. It's an important dimension of the system, this gender aspect. Yeah. So yes, absolutely. Oh, well, that's a fascinating story and a complex issue in itself. No, Jamaica differed from America, number one, in its demographic structure. The majority of the American population was always white. In fact, at the highest point of slavery in Georgia and Mississippi, the slave population was rarely more than a third of the total population. There's a large white poor population. The Jamaica, from as early as 1710, over 80% of the population was black and slave. Secondly, in the US, the majority of the population were free and white. In Jamaica, the majority of the population were black. Just like Jamaica is a classic large-scale slave system. However, you did have distinctions, important somatic racial distinctions. There emerged slowly a group, a mixed group, known as the colored, the free, and they they were the product of the white man and the black woman, and very often their children were freed. And so they came to occupy a middle group, known as the freed colored. Eventually, they won complete civil liberties by 1826. They were still discriminated against. But what emerged from this system was a color class hierarchy, whereas being white was viewed as the ideal, being colored, middle, being black was denigrated. And no one promoted this more than the colored middle group itself. Now, in the Caribbean, they were seen as very important, in spite of their small numbers, as a buffer between the whites and the blacks. And that was the basis of the color class hierarchy, with color being valued highly, even though this is a black society. Now, you had the same thing in the US, too, but with one important difference. The free colored population was discouraged from living in the slave society in America. In fact, Virginia at one point required all free blacks to leave the state because they set a bad example for the slaves, for the desire to be free. But so color and race became very important in developing a colorific system in which being lighter skinned was greatly valued. And it had economic consequences in Jamaica. Now, so if you go to Jamaica now, you'll still notice that the elite is overwhelmingly more light-skinned. And then there are few whites, relatively few whites left. In America, it was thought for a long time that this did not exist as much. But there's a growing body of scholarship in the US now, one of whom is in my department, Monk, Ellis Monk. He's the grandson of Thelonious Monk, for those of you who are into jazz. But he's a first-rate sociologist who works on color and the role of color stratification within the black community, and found that it is almost as great as it is in Brazil, where it's notorious. So yeah, race and color came to occupy a very distinctive role in Caribbean societies as a result of slavery, and persisted right down to this day. One very sad feature of Jamaican society right now, which we'll read in almost a week doesn't go by in which there's a letter to the editor complaining about the use of skin bleachers, skin bleaching cream in Jamaica, of all places, the land of Bob Marley. So which shows that it still persists. So that was one of the major consequences of slavery. the emergence of this middle group, which is valued in Jamaica, and a culture which values lighter complexion, which persists to this day. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but is that?
How big is the middle group roughly at around 1830? Do we know this? Because
how big is what?
This middle group.
Middle group.
Because they come from reproduction between enslaved people and white slaveholding people.
Exactly.
And that's why I'm asking, because
it was never very large.
It was very small.
It was never very large. No, it was not like Brazil or Cuba even. It was rarely more than 10%. But they were very valued as a buffer. And in fact, in 1826, they won in a law complete civil liberties. They could own property, they could vote, and so on. And interestingly, they won complete civil liberties at the same time that the Jews did, because the Jews were discriminated against in the system too. Then 1826 law gave full civil liberties to the colored, the free colored, and the Jews at the same time. And they could vote and so on. Many of them became quite prominent, but there were never more than 10% or so, because the population of whites was relatively small. And as I said, you didn't have much reproduction at all. Many of them, the white population is relatively small, so the number of, and even though they were exploiting the slave women, the mortality rate was so high that not many of them survived. It's quite different in Brazil and Cuba, where you had a much larger population.
Well, then, thank you very much for joining us tonight and coming to the Museum Hegel-Haus, and for your interest in this topic. And we wish you a very nice evening and the rest of the week. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.